Welcome all. Fact Daddy here, giving it to you raw data, that is. On this episode, Fact Daddy does COVID-19 mortality rates. You may have seen different mortality rates and wonder exactly what they mean, from the case fatality rate to the crude fatality rate, or even the infection fatality rate. I'm going to discuss all of these things in detail so you have a better understanding of what each one means and how it's calculated. Let's start with the case fatality rate, or CFR. You've probably seen this talked about in the media. Sometimes it's referred to as the case fatality ratio or the case fatality risk, or even in some cases, case mortality ratio or case mortality risk. Basically, you'll hear the words fatality and mortality used interchangeably. So when it comes to the case fatality ratio or the case fatality rate, it is not the same as your chance of dying if you're infected. That would be the infection fatality rate, which we'll get to later. To calculate the CFR, you take the number of deaths from the disease divided by the number of those diagnosed cases of the disease, and then you multiply that by 100. For example, we'll take the latest data from Worldometer. The current deaths are listed at 175,500, so you would take that number and divide it by the total cases, which is 5,667,000. After doing this, it'll give you a result of 0.00396%. You multiply that by 100, and it comes to a case fatality rate of 3.09 or 3.1%. When it comes to the crude mortality rate or the crude fatality rate, also called the crude death rate, it measures the probability that any individual in the population will die from their disease, not just those who are infected or confirmed cases as being infected. It's calculated by dividing the number of deaths from the disease by the total population, and then multiplying that by 100. For this example, we'll go ahead and take the U.S. population and the U.S. deaths. Again, the deaths as mentioned in the previous example are 175,500 deaths. You divide that by the 328 million people in the United States, multiply it by 100, and you end up with 0.05 crude mortality rate. Depending on how you want to present this data, you can get it to fit your agenda accordingly. That's why it's important to give all the information. Lastly, we'll talk about calculating the IFR, or the infection fatality rate. This method of calculation is to determine the severity of any disease. To obtain the infection fatality rate, you need to take the number of deaths from the disease, divide it by the number of infected individuals, and then multiply that by 100. Both the case fatality rate and the infection fatality rate are hard to determine due to the lag in data for the cases and the unknown amount of infections. There are those who are asymptomatic, and then there are those who don't even get tested and go to the doctor, so those numbers are unknown. When there are people who have the disease and they're not diagnosed, the CFR will overestimate the true risk of death. With COVID-19, it's thought that there are many undiagnosed people. However, when some people are currently sick and will die of disease but have not yet died, the CFR will underestimate the true risk of death. With COVID-19, there are many who are currently sick and will die but have not yet died. Or they may die from the disease but be listed as having died from something else, and vice versa. In calculating the IFR, it can be incredibly difficult because the number of asymptomatic cases and those that have not been tested and received positive results can range from 10 to 70% of the entire population. Both IFR and CFR can vary in ranges depending on pre-existing conditions and age. In a paper from May 13th that includes the results of 36 individual studies, estimates that the infection fatality rate ranges from 0.00 to 1.63. Across 32 different locations, the median infection fatality rate was 0.27%, which was eventually corrected to 0.24%. Most of these studies were performed in the pandemic epicenters with high death tolls. The median IFR was 0.1 in locations with COVID-19 population mortality rate less than the global average, 0.27 in locations with 73 to 500 COVID-19 deaths per million, and 0.9% in locations exceeding 500 COVID-19 deaths per million. In a more recent study from July 23rd, it estimates that the IFR is close to zero for young adults, but rises exponentially with age, reaching about 0.3% for those aged 50 to 59, 1.3% for those ages 60 to 69, 4% for ages 70 to 79, and 10% for ages 80 to 89. However, both of these studies have yet to be peer-reviewed. Also of note, according to the CDC, it is estimated that the overall infection fatality rate is 0.65%. This data is presented for you to question, for you to comment on, and for you to research. If you like what you're hearing, feel free to subscribe to the channel and share. As always, respect one another, love one another, and take care of each other, even your enemies. Fact Daddy out.